Hi, I'm Katie. Welcome to my channel, Chords Records. 10 1980s soundtracks in celebration of the Oscars this weekend. I am doing soundtracks, and this won't be the last time I talk about 1980s soundtracks. I absolutely love them. My guilty pleasure. I collect a lot of them. So I've picked out 10. Maybe not some of them not so obvious, some of them a little bit obvious, but I think you'll find there's something for everyone in this batch. So it was such a great era for films for my generation, I guess. The soundtracks were outstanding, quite often compilations. Often they recorded new material for them, songs. The first one I'm showing here, of course, is The Big Easy, the classic 1986 romantic thriller from New Orleans. Very much an extra character in the film was the music for this. I mean, you can see some of the artists on there. This was one of my favourite soundtracks in the 80s. Dennis Quaid was the star. He actually has a song on here and he sings live in the film. What's the song? Closer to You. There it is. That's 1986 on Island label. The next one was my favourite film from the 1980s. This is a polarising film. The Big Chill. I absolutely love this film. I saved up all my money. It was like $180 to buy a VHS of this, and I also bought the film poster at the time. It was one of the very first VHSs that had come to New Zealand, and oh my God, this is such a great film, in my opinion. Of course, the plot is the reunion of a bunch of friends who are coming together for one weekend to celebrate their friend who has passed away. The soundtrack is just classic kind of 60s rock. We're talking Temptations, The Rascals, Smokey Robinson, Three Dog Night, Aretha Franklin, Procol Harum with A Whiter Shade of Pale, Heard It Through the Grapevine, Marvin Gaye. It is just such a great soundtrack. And in fact, I loved it so much, I also have the more songs from The Big Chill, another great collection of inspired music from the time. Okay, the next one is so that was from 1983, and the next one's from 1988, and it's the soundtrack to the film Tequila Sunrise. Now, the film, not so great. Soundtrack, brilliant. And you'll find with a lot of these albums, the soundtrack is better than the actual film. And the 80s was such a great time. This one, Mel Gibson, Michelle Pfeiffer, just absolutely brilliant. I just see here I've got a sample record, not for sale. The first song on here was the single Surrender to Me, which was a duet between Ann Wilson from Heart and Robin Zander from Cheap Trick. I think it hit number 6 on the Billboard charts. But it's actually not a bad film, to be honest. It's kind of like a romantic crime kind of vibe. And of course, Kurt Russell there as well. So the music it's a mixed bag. You have Duran Duran on here. There's a lot of British bands on these soundtracks. It was a real thing in the 80s. Duran Duran, but then you have the Australian band Crowded House, Ziggy Marley, the classic Beach Boys song Don't Worry Baby, re-recorded by the Beach Boys and the Everly Brothers, I think for this soundtrack, 1986. The Church, another Australian band, and then followed by a Bobby Darin song. It's a really mixed bag, but a really fun soundtrack to put on if you're having a fun dinner party. Okay, the next one you may not have heard of, Letter to Brezhnev. It's a very low-budget British film about working-class Liverpool in the 80s, about two girls who meet for one weekend, a couple of Russian sailors. Low budget, not well known. However, the soundtrack is fantastic. And I'll just show you the back cover here. One of the special treats on this soundtrack is Sandy Shaw, who had a #1 hit in 1964 with Always Something There to Remind Me, the Burt Bacharach and Hal David song. She re-recorded it for this soundtrack, and it's beautiful. It has these lush strings, and it's just wonderful. Fine Young Cannibals is on here. Bronski Beat, Paul Quinn. You get the idea. It's just classic 80s working class Britain. Letter to Brezhnev, a great soundtrack, and that is on the London label. Okay, don't judge me with this one. This was an awful film, but such a fun 80s soundtrack. And I'm talking, believe it or not, Summer Lovers. Rotten Tomatoes, maybe 40%, like just awful film. And actually, sad fact about the third person, that's Daryl Hannah, and who was that again? Peter Gallagher. Sad fact about the third actress, what was her name? Valerie Quenson. She retired after this film to raise children, and she died in a car crash when she was 31. So very sad. It was her last acting performance. But this soundtrack is so much fun. It's, again, classic 80s. We have Depeche Mode, Tina Turner singing Johnny and Mary. You've got Heaven 17, Elton John, Take Me Down to the Ocean, Tina Turner, Crazy in the Night, great song. Chicago, Hard to Say I'm Sorry, that #1 song they had that year. It's a really fun summer soundtrack. Awful film. Probably can get it for $1. Brilliant. Don't judge me. All right, the next one is another great soundtrack. It's long forgotten, in my opinion. It's the Something Wild soundtrack from 1986. This was the Jonathan Demme comedy thriller with Melanie Griffith and Jeff Daniels, starring Ray Liotta, and it's basically. He runs away from his very conservative business role, jumps in a car with this wild girl, and they go on a road trip. But there's a bit of crime in there, and it's just such a great... It's actually a really underrated film, in my opinion. And look at that back cover. Is that fantastic? The soundtrack, though, is just brilliant. Oh, UB40, Fine Young Cannibals, Jimmy Cliff... It's just fantastic. What else have we got? With or Without You, sung by Steve Jones. Man with a Gun, Jerry Harrison. New Orders on here. Really fun soundtrack. And the next one's not dissimilar, but sort of more from the British vibe. And it's called Party Party. This was a really great... it was a soundtrack that... It was a film, really. It was the first British film in the tradition of the great John Hughes American films. And it's essentially set around New Year's Eve. It's one of those kind of New Year's Eve based kind of storylines. And you can see on there the people in it, Altered Images, the soundtrack, Altered Images, Bananarama, Bad Manners, Chaz and Dave, Elvis Costello and the Attractions, Madness, Sting, really great. Sting does a beautiful cover. They're mostly covers. Sting does a beautiful cover of Tutti Frutti. It's just like rock and roll. And what else have we got here? Midge-Ure. Oh, and Sting does also Need Your Love So Bad, which just a lot of fun. Okay. Now, this one is a bit of an outlier. So Party Party was a film from 1983. This is a bit of an outlier. This is called Diva, a 1981 French thriller film. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it has the most exquisite... It's about a young man who's obsessed with an opera singer, and so there's a lot of kind of that opera music on the soundtrack. But what the famous piece being La Wally by Catalini and the aria from that, and it opens up the record and closes the record, and it's, if you can get a good copy, and you can get them for like $4, they're not super expensive. It's a beautiful soundtrack. It's a little bit hard to listen to, because you go from listening to a beautiful opera, and then you might go into a little bit of French new wave. So it's quite, there is no kind of thematic music through it, but you can get it quite cheaply. And you can see there I've got an audiophile pressing. Apparently, I'm not sure if it is audiophile, to be honest. So that's Diva, and a fantastic film. It's a cult classic, and it really stands up, and it's worth watching. Right, 2 more to go. So number 9, I think I might have shown this before. I absolutely love this film, and of course, it's The Lost Boys, with a lot of vampire comedy in it. It's a comedy horror, or horror comedy. The soundtrack, of course, is famous, and you've got In Excess and Jimmy Barnes, Echo and the Bunnymen. It's just so fantastic. People Are Strange, re-recorded by Lou Gramm. It's just absolutely a killer soundtrack. And it's actually a really brilliant film that I think also is just such a classic 80s film. And then finally, one of my favourite of the 1980s, this is a John Hughes film, and it's Some Kind of Wonderful. Look at them. Look at those babies. And the character here, just can't quite remember her name. Oh, Mary Stuart Masterton, Eric Stoltz, and Leah Thompson in the middle. Mary Stuart Masterton is a drummer in the film, and it's kind of a bit of a love triangle, I guess. It is just such a great soundtrack, and it was very almost emerging artists, music you'd never heard of before, and almost harked back to the 70s punk era, or really kind of, or into the new wave of the 80s. I Go Crazy by Flesh for Lulu, Cry Like This, Blue Room, Jesus and Mary Chain, The Apartments, The March Violets. It is just an absolute stunner of an 80s soundtrack. I love this film. There you have it. Enjoy the Oscars. I'll see you next time. Bye.